Victor Sims, the Z historian. Now it is said there are three things that have been omnipresent in every society: music, religion, and beer. But in Zambia, a hidden history lies behind the story of liquor, a story of intrigue and mystique, of ancient traditions and colonial conquests, of powerful spirits and bitter struggles. A tale of a liquid elixir that has flowed through the veins of the land for centuries, shaping its people and its destiny. In this episode, we uncover the secrets of the history of alcohol in Zambia. From the mysterious origins of traditional brews, we uncover the fascinating story of how this intoxicating substance shaped the nation's liberation struggle and explore the unknown depths of Zambia's rich and complex historical relationship with alcohol. Contrary to common beliefs, Europeans did not introduce alcohol to Africa. Prior to colonialism, in rural households across northern Rhodesia, like in other parts of Africa, women brewed various fermented grain beers. The thick reddish-grey brew, which was usually made from sorghum or finger millet, was dried, grounded to a fine powder, fermented and boiled. The result was, in the words of native race committees, a beverage hardly as alcoholic as the lightest European beer and extremely wholesome. Thus, besides being an essential element of diet, beer also played a significant role in the community life as a common means of exchange or payment for services rendered, tribute, religious rituals, and of course, to sweeten social intercourse. However, because beer had specific social value and brewing was hard work, which required substantial amounts of grain, drinking was for most African communities an occasional activity. Nevertheless, during the times of the year when grains were plentiful and women had less work to do in the fields, communal beer parties lasting long into the night were the main source of entertainment in village life. And since grain beers were highly perishable, there was little point in going home until all the beer pots were completely empty. In those days, men saw beer parties as an opportunity to relax and to let down their guard. In fact, the amount of beer consumed was actually relatively small and the alcohol content low. Casual drinking dominated most of the 1800s. However, with the rise of the mining industry on the Copper Belt in the 1920s came migrations, urbanization, and a huge demand for beer. And with that demand came chaos. In the late 1920s, with the rise of the copper mining industry in northern Rhodesia and the related growth of the copper belt towns and mining compounds, beer brewing became rampant. And soon, colonial authorities sought much stricter regulations against brewing and drinking by Africans. But that's not all. By 1930, colonial authorities saw the revenue potential of beer brewing and selling. And as such, whilst banning beer brewing and selling by Africans, city councils were permitted either to monopolize the manufacture or sale of beer or to provide licenses to individuals to brew and sell it for huge profits. By the early 1930s, the British had effectively banned all African brewing in towns and strongly encouraged the white settler-controlled municipalities to brew and sell grain beers at beer halls modeled on those established in Durban, South Africa. For example, the first beer hall in Luanshya was opened in 1929, and by 1937, beer hall profits amounted to £6,000. Later, this would increase to about £339,000 per year. Further, the enactment of the Native Beer Ordinance led to more beer halls being constructed on the Copper Belt. And apart from beer halls began selling snacks and mineral water. Furthermore, as in Durban, South Africa, profits from sales of beer were to be dedicated to the provision of basic amenities in African residential areas. In other words, beer hall proceeds would foot the bill for maintaining a strict system of residential segregation. Not surprisingly, the local white settler community, notable for its racism, gave strong support to this policy. In northern Rhodesia, beer areas were also established by the 1934 Native Beer Regulations. These areas were covering a radius of 6 to 16 kilometers in which beer was not to be manufactured or possessed without a permit. Thus, in these beer areas, only local authorities were permitted to make, possess, or sell beer. Further, the enactment of the Native Beer Amendment Ordinance of 1941 led to the establishment of guard areas. The guard areas were established on the fringes of beer areas to further stamp out illicit beer brewing in urban and peri-urban areas. In guard areas, Africans were allowed to manufacture or pack beer for home consumption. However, while there was no need for a permit to produce or possess beer, one had to get a permit from the district commissioner in order for one to sell any of their beer. On the other hand, right from the onset, Africans were not allowed to drink bottled beers, wines, or spirits. Laws against distillation and sale of bottled beer, wines, and spirits was brought into force as early as 1919. From that time, it was argued that the introduction of hard liquor would make Africans unruly and difficult to govern, leading to loss of morals and impoverishment of African societies. However, the main idea behind the laws was to reduce competition between beer and other manufactured articles, especially those made from maize and cotton. Initially, having adopted the policy of promoting self-sufficiency in its colonies, the British expected all colonies, and especially northern Rhodesia, to sponsor its own welfare programs for Africans. As such, the British gave minimal financial assistance to our colonies, which were expected to raise monies through direct and indirect taxation. Furthermore, since direct taxation was unpopular, activities such as sale of beer was meant to be an important source of revenue to sponsor African welfare programs. Unfortunately, little was used for the intended purpose, and most of the profits made out of beer sales, about 40 to 70%, was sent back to Britain. Meanwhile, African mining communities remained impoverished and depraved, fueling feelings of resentment that would soon cause the entire structure to implode. In the 1900s, beer halls were both resented and frequented by urban Africans. Ironically, Africans perceived beer halls as instruments of their poverty and symbols of colonial oppression, and yet recognized they met certain social and recreational needs. Substantively, beer halls were the nerve centers of mining compounds and acted as a form of social control over African mine workers. It was at beer halls that the conduct of African workers was monitored during their off-work hours. Further, beer halls formed part of the process of stabilization in the mining town. To be sure, despite earning low wages, Africans were expected to spend nearly all earnings on opaque beer and later on bottled beer and wines. Mine management especially despised workers that did not drink opaque beer and alcoholic beverages in general. The belief was that such laborers would save enough earnings to escape labor employment and return to their home villages. Thus, at one level, beer halls and beer were a means of reducing labor turnover that would translate into increased productivity and profits for the mines. In short, the more Africans became hooked on beer, the more they became destitute and dependent on the mines, and the more the mines made profit. Moreover, since the food rations Africans received from mining management were not sufficient, mining authorities found it expedient to encourage Africans to supplement their meals with opaque beer. Colonial officials, mining authorities, and doctors alike all agreed that African opaque beer contained some nourishing food elements. 1 gallon of good African beer was said to contain approximately 2,800 calories and about 26.6 grams of protein, in addition to high vitamin content. On the other hand, colonial authorities in northern Rhodesia, like most Europeans, generally believed that where possible, Africans should not be permitted to drink spirits. Further, white employers favored limited hours of sale of alcohol as they felt that Africans could not restrain their drinking and therefore could not be trusted to come to work sober. The requirement that drinking be confined to a few beer halls under the strict control of a white supervisor in itself implied a fear that widespread drinking would threaten the security of white residential areas, that the beer halls had to be fenced and were permitted to open only during daylight hours underscored these worries. No beer was to be sold in the night or between noon and 3 p.m. However, embedded within concerns about unregulated drinking were fears that alcohol made Africans sexually aggressive and violent, and that white women might become targets to these impulses. As a result, in the early days, no off-sales were allowed and beer had to be drunk on the beer hall premises. Consequently, large crowds soon began to congregate at these beer halls, and by 1960, some beer halls on the Copperbelt entertained as many as 70,000 people. With huge numbers of Africans frequenting beer halls, they soon became squalid, noisy, and crowded places where all manner of issues were discussed, including rebellion. It all began collapsing after World War II. The conscious African assault on racially inspired liquor laws began in the years immediately following the Second World War with the challenge to the prohibition on Africans' consumption of European-type bottled beer and wine. A few of the relatively well-off and well-educated Africans who protested this ban had acquired a taste for bottled beer while in the armed services. But for most, the issue was mainly symbolic. The consumption of bottled lagered beer was an emblem of the European lifestyles and values that they had been encouraged to aspire to, and which separated them from the masses of the Africans. As such, the law forbidding the consumption of European-type beer was a continuous reminder to members of the African elite that northern Rhodesia was a racist society. And thus alcohol became weaved into the struggle for liberation. In 1946, immediately after colonial government had confidently asserted that Africans in northern Rhodesia had no interest in consuming bottled beer and wine, members of the newly formed African Representative Council, ARC, vigorously disputed that contention. Much to the surprise of government officials, the members devoted a good portion of their opening debate to an attack on racially inspired liquor laws and in particular the ban on bottled beer and wine. Nelson Nalumango claimed that, "Wherever I've traveled in my area in the southern province, I have been asked why we, the leaders who have been chosen to represent the views of the people, should not approach the government about Africans being granted permission to buy European beer." Another member hit directly at the racial assumption behind the prohibition. It is a very surprising thing that Africans are allowed to drink their own beer in the beer halls and that they are prevented from buying European beer. I cannot see any difference between a person who drinks European beer and a person who drinks African beer. The intoxication is just the same. Pressured by African leaders and mine workers' strikes that occurred in 1935 and 1940, by 1948, legislation was passed which permitted Africans to buy bottled beer, wines and spirits on premises specifically licensed for that purpose. As expected, the legislation of bottled beer, which had a higher alcohol percentage of 3 to 6%, not only took a toll on the African wages but also slowed down the consumption of opaque beer. But despite the drop in consumption of opaque beer, management still continued to make profits as Africans would pool resources to buy tots and bottles of wine. They usually also added wine to opaque beer to make it strong. And by 1955, the Native Beer Ordinance was amended to increase alcohol percentage in opaque beer from 4 to 6%, and many Africans reverted to consuming the local brew. However, the high price of opaque beer sold in beer halls soon became a major factor to the disillusionment and alienation of Africans against both colonial authorities and mining management. High cost of beer took a heavy toll on the wages of African workers, resulting in many ending up in debt or forcing their wives to engage in activities such as vegetable selling in order to supplement meager family income. Soon, mine workers' wives became involved in illicit beer brewing. Further, beer drinking equally had a telling effect in that many African children in the Copper Belt in the 1940s and 50s suffered from malnutrition as a result of African workers' salaries being channeled to support high consumption of both opaque and bottled beer. But as long as beer hall profits remained the main source of income for colonial authorities, little attention was paid to the dangers inherent in excessive beer drinking as witnessed on the Copper Belt in the late 1950s and 60s. For example, in the late 1950s, African mine workers at Nkana mine are said to have been consuming more than 228,000 gallons of opaque beer per month. By then, alcoholism amongst African workers had become a source of worry, interfering with the very fabric of African societies. Between July and August 1956, Africans on the Copper Belt, and in particular at Mufulira, boycotted both beer halls and other welfare centers in protest against poor recreational and welfare facilities in general. By then, Africans had come to realize that the entire colonial structure was dependent largely on revenue from beer halls, and that if they struck against the beer hall system, then the entire colonial structure would crumble. As a result, most Copper Belt riots in the 1950s began in and around beer halls. From early 1962 to mid-1963, there were major disturbances in the Copper Belt which led to the death of 10 people and the damage of property worth £2,500. And one of the long-term causes of these disturbances were the beer hall systems. Moreover, many people found that beer halls were easily mobilized by political agitators to fight against the entire colonial system itself. It must be noted that as early as 1948, the so-called Chicken Report strongly recommended the abolishing of the beer hall system. However, mining authorities opposed the proposal, and beer halls remained a symbol of segregation and exploitation. Nevertheless, by 1964, as Zambia was gaining independence, the government decided to replace beer halls by less degrading drinking establishments known as taverns, which catered for only about 200 people. The decision was of course challenged by the mining conglomerates, who argued that the smaller taverns were uneconomical. But to consolidate its decision, the government further slapped a levy on opaque beer sold in old and larger beer halls in order to promote the smaller taverns. The levy came into effect on 1st July 1964. After Zambia got independence in October 1964, old beer halls were dismantled, and some, such as the beer hall in Chamboli compound in Kitwe, were converted into community centers, while those in Mindolo and Musakile were converted into markets. In the late 1980s, Zambia was facing a period of great economic and political turmoil. The country's president, Kenneth Kaunda, had been in power for nearly 3 decades and was feeling the pressure of mounting criticism from both within and outside the country. During this difficult time, President Kaunda made a shocking announcement that he was planning to resign from his position as president. The reason for this unexpected decision is concern over the impact of alcohol.